Welcome to my channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I'm Sarah, former binge eater turned psychotherapist. And today I'm quite excited to talk to you about this one because I think it's important. I might even go as far as to say if you can master this skill, you will be able to make peace with food in your body. And I don't say that lightly. Those of you who've watched my videos before know I don't make bold claims about many of the things that I talk about. You may also have heard me say before that I see binge eating as a conflict, an inner conflict between two parts of us. You've got the part that wants to binge and you've got the part that doesn't. It's like those two parts are fighting it out all the time. And what often happens is you just want the part that doesn't want to binge to win. You want that to become you and to get rid of this part of you that seems to keep being drawn back to the food. And that's what set up the conflict. So what I'm going to talk about in this video very much involves looking at ourselves in parts. Part of us that wants this, part of us that feels this, part of us that believes this, and there's all this noise. And I mean, binge eating and eating disorders, they're often spoken about as this battle. And it really feels like that, doesn't it? It feels like you are battling yourself day in, day out, over and over again. And how many times have you said to yourself and sworn blind and meant it with every fibre of your being when you said from this moment onwards or from tomorrow, I'm going to do things differently. I'm just going to be different around food. The part of me that doesn't want to binge is the part that's going to win out, and I'm just going to, almost through sheer will, become that. And then it doesn't happen. How often have you done that? If you're like me, I was doing that every single day for years, which probably means a few thousand times I promised myself I was going to be different and then I wasn't. And that set up an enormous conflict with myself. I didn't like myself because I felt like I was this person who could just never keep their word. I was inconsistent, I lacked discipline, I didn't have enough willpower, and I clearly wasn't trying hard enough because I wasn't getting the results that I wanted. And so for the longest time, I thought the answer laid in trying harder, but in the trying harder, that just kept creating more and more conflict. I've said this before, one of the ways you can discern whether you struggle with disordered eating is it's as if the harder you try, the worse it gets. And somebody else who doesn't struggle with disordered eating, but maybe just finds it harder to regulate their food, they try harder and they seem to get results. And the rest of us that fall into this disordered eating, we can't understand why we're not like that. So now we're in conflict with this idea of who we're supposed to be. There's another conflict. I think we have dozens of these conflicts going on, possibly even simultaneously in one moment. So the skill, the thing that needs to be practiced and honed and developed, is the skill of conflict resolution, inner conflict resolution. You know that moment when it might be you're sitting at home and the food's calling to you in the other room and you're going, no, I mustn't have it. And your mind just keeps hooking and obsessing on the food. And you're in this conflict with yourself. You're battling with yourself about whether to go and have the food. When you're there in that very moment, that conflict feels like it can never be resolved until you have the food. Because in theory, each time you keep saying, no, I'm not going to have the food, it stays there, it stays there, it stays there. But once you've had the food and the food's gone, you might be left with a sense of guilt or shame or disappointment, but at least you're not in conflict anymore. It's really uncomfortable to be in conflict. And I think some of you might be thinking that you're not trying hard enough because, and tell me if you do this, because this was me as well. You might be same situation, you have a thought about the food and you don't even try and fight it. You just go straight and you have the food. And then afterwards you beat yourself up. So I didn't even try to not have it. But you've been through this scenario enough times where you've been in this conflict and your brain knows how it ends. So it's like it's trying to save you the pain and the stress and the tension of going into conflict by saying, just do it now, don't even think about it. So we either end up exhausting ourselves in conflict or we end up avoiding, going into compulsion, and that's a big part of the binge eating cycle as well. So you might be thinking, well, that's all well and good, but how do I get better at resolving conflict? I'm glad you asked. The first rule of conflict resolution is that all parties need to be heard. we have this innate desire to be heard and understood and validated. I used to see this all the time as a police officer. When I would turn up and there's a conflict and people are angry with one another, if you really listened to each party, people became much calmer. And the people who were really angry and aggressive when you got there were now calm and perfectly compliant if they need to be arrested. And it might be that some of you, this is a common scenario that may or may not apply to you, but you might have a difficult relationship with one or both parents. You may have a lot of ideas about how your parents let you down and didn't do the job that you feel they were supposed to do. What many people in that situation want is we want the parent to go, yes, I let you down. Yes, I get that my actions had an impact on you. We know that the past can't be changed, but if we're angry with someone about something and they acknowledge their part and they acknowledge our feelings, a lot of the time the emotional, these heightened emotions, whether it's anger or sadness or fear, whatever it might be, tend to dissipate. This is why we do this with inner stuff. This is why listening to each part, listening to the part that wants to binge. And you may think, well, the part that wants to binge, it's got nothing to say. It's just this compulsion that takes me over. Compulsion doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's normally something, some kind of build-up that leads to the point of compulsion. Now, it could be restriction around food. That's a common one. It could be an emotional trigger. It could even be habit. Habit can feel like a compulsion when you're used to doing something at a certain time in a certain way. To not do it sometimes feels really agitating. You feel like you have to do it because it feels like an absence of something not to. So rather than trying to destroy or pretend the part that wants to binge or the part that hates your body, actually giving it a voice, allowing it to tell its story, take some of the emotional charge. But the important part of this is there's an intention behind it, an intention behind being genuinely interested in what this part has to say. Because this is a part of you, it will know if you're not really interested. Because what also will sometimes happen is that part will start to reveal itself and then the judgment comes in. Judge and shame ourselves for this part because we're identifying ourselves as this. If we allow it to come up, if we allow the sadness and the despair to come up, it will swallow us and it will be what we become, and that's just not true. Another thing to consider when you are developing this skill of resolving in a conflict is to anticipate conflict. You know, as I was talking about earlier, that putting your head on the pillow and making all these promises about how you're going to eat tomorrow, conflict isn't anticipated. So when it actually comes, when tomorrow comes and the urge is there and the thoughts are telling you to go and eat something, and then you do, and then now you've blown it and you're back in that cycle again, you didn't take this into account the night before. You just told yourself who you were going to be, how you were going to feel, and what you were going to do. So I'll often ask people, how do you want to treat yourself when you fall short of your own expectations? And there's often a lot of resistance to this question because what people want is they'll say, I don't want to fall short of my own expectations. I don't want to binge again, so therefore I don't want to plan how I'm going to react when I binge again because binging again is absolutely unacceptable. So that means if you do, bam, another conflict. What do you do with that? So anticipation is so important. I was on a retreat at the weekend, and it was a silent retreat, but there was a lot of exercises where we did talk. There was just no chit chat, and it was intense. It was possibly one of the most emotionally intense experiences of my life, and I'm still, having recently come out of it, trying to figure out what that was all about. I went to the gates of hell and back. That's what it felt like. But when I arrived on that first night and I got into bed, I remember still feeling quite excited about this weekend. And as I laid in bed, there was a part of me, a little wise part of me, that said, Sarah, you're going to want to leave at some point and you need to stay. And I kind of responded. I was like, yeah, no, it's fine. I'm going to stay. And it went, no. You are going to want to leave and you need to stay. And I thought, oh, it's going to get tough. Because in my mind, it was okay. That first night was fine. So I was like, yeah, I'll stay. I'll do this. not anticipating how hard it was going to get. It got really hard. I mean, I don't even have words for it right now, but just the terror, the shame, everything that I went through. Had I not prepared, had I not had that moment on that first night where I made a commitment to myself that I was going to stay no matter what. And I knew what my mind would do. I knew my mind would go, this is a load of rubbish, this doesn't work, this is pointless, this isn't safe. And I remember at that time when I was making this commitment to stay, thinking, okay, no matter what, I'm going to stay. Even if I think this is an absolute pile of rubbish, I am going to stay. And so when my mind did start saying, this is rubbish, you need to go, I was like, well, yeah, no, I knew I was going to think this is ridiculous at some point. But that was, in hindsight, that was a kind of a protective thing. Let's think this is a load of rubbish and then I don't have to stay, I can go. But what also happened in the commitment that I made was I took away the negotiating. Had I not made that commitment and I'd gone through what I'd gone through, there would have been those moments when I was thinking about going where I would have seriously negotiated with myself about whether to go. And chances are, once I get into that serious kind of negotiation, I would have gone. That part would have won. I'd have convinced myself there's no point staying. So when you are anticipating what something might look like with food, I think you can make some gentle commitments. You can make some non-negotiables, but do not make those non-negotiables from a state of conflict. So that first night I was feeling pretty good, so I made the non-negotiable to stay. Had I tried to do that later on, when I was all in my emotions and everything was heightened, it wouldn't have worked because it wasn't coming from a wiser part of me. I think everybody is very wise, but we struggle to tap into it, we struggle to trust it, because especially if our emotions are big and you make those decisions, you know, you've just binged and that's the time that you make your non-negotiables. You make those non-negotiables in a place when you are calm, when you feel connected enough to the wiser part of you. That's another part. And even with your non-negotiables, they need to be gentle. So what might some of those be? Non-negotiables can be, I am going to have my anchor meals, my breakfast, lunch and dinner. And that's not a negotiation. There might be an occasion where something happens that's outside of your control and you don't get to do that. And that's okay too, anticipating how you'll respond. Because if you feel like you're on, this is this streak thinking, if you feel like you're on this great streak and you've been doing your non-negotiables all the time, and then you have a day where for whatever reason it goes out the window, that I've blown it thinking can completely derail you. So even planning how to get back to your non-negotiables, again, when you fail to meet your expectations, which you will do at some point. And one of the reasons why this conflict resolution is so challenging for so many of us is because we are the black and white, all or nothing thinkers. And this is the antithesis to black and white thinking. And I think it's really important to mention as well that conflict resolution doesn't mean no dissonance. And the word dissonance just means a lack of agreement or a disharmony. So it's conflict resolution doesn't mean like, oh, okay, now I feel like this is resolved and I feel like every part of me is on the same page. We've got different parts that are competing all the time. But the black and white thinking thinks, oh, this feels uncomfortable and I need to make it one thing or another. That's where conflict comes from. It's a result of the black and white thinking because things aren't black and white. So accepting that we are both, accepting that we are selfish and selfless, that we are kind and we are cruel, that we want freedom around food and we want control. Like both of those things can be true. And if we accept that both actually can coexist, the conflict almost comes when there's a resistance to what is, when there's this desperation to go, it's this or it's that. Most of the time we can't turn something into one thing. It's this really binary thinking that ties people up. What's the right thing to do at the moment? I'll often get messages from people who say, in this situation, blah, 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 I've been doing this, is this right? And I think, almost invariably, my worldview, there isn't a right and wrong. unless it comes down to deliberately inflicting pain on other people. There are just lots of decisions we have to make. If we don't figure out this conflict thing, I think being ourselves is unbearable. Conflict can feel so unsafe, to not know whether something is one thing or another. But what I've come to realize is there's a real, when it's not resisted, I have found a real sense of peace in things not being one thing or another, that they are both and they are neither. And that if we're in dissonance, we don't need to figure out where we stand. That's not necessarily the job. The task is to not turn it into a conflict, because conflict is what turns pain into suffering. If you're in emotional or physical pain and your mind is so strongly resisting, it shouldn't be like that. The fact I'm in pain means, and then you layer on a load of really unpleasant meaning on top of that, you've just increased your pain by like tenfold and turned it into this suffering. And because, this journey of healing your relationship with food is such inner work, no one, including me, is going to be able to tell you what to do. Those of us that work in this field, all we do is point at stuff. And we're like, look at this, think about this, what about this, what about that? And then the journey of recovery is taking that and taking it inward and figuring out what that means for you. There'll be stuff that I've said today that you think, I don't even get that. What is she going on about? That's fine. And there'll be other things that may have really resonated. Just focus on what has resonated with you and take it in. Sit with it a bit. My encouragement, if you've got this far in the video, is that when it ends, stay for a couple of minutes. Just stay with whatever it is. Stay with the experience of being you, with the intention of not judging yourself for it. Everything, like every emotion in my mind is okay, and when you judge your emotions and how you feel, you'll really suffer. You'll really suffer for that. And I don't want that for you. I don't want that for me, and I don't want that for you. And I'm feeling a little bit evangelical about this retreat that I went on. So if anyone else is interested in doing it, I will pop the details below. All I can say is that since coming back from the retreat, I feel more in my body than I've ever felt in my entire life. I feel more emotionally open. And maybe this lasts and maybe it doesn't, and I'm not going to get in a conflict about that. I'm just going to enjoy the beingness and the afterglow of the experience. Anyway, thank you for watching. I appreciate you all. And I'll see you on the next video.